There comes a moment in human history when silence turns into song, when the chaos of survival softens into the hum of cooperation, the steady rhythm of footsteps across packed earth, the murmur of neighbors, the crackle of fires lit not just for warmth but for gathering. The first societies were born not from conquest nor invention, but from something quieter, the desire to live together, to share purpose, to belong. By now, the world had already learned to write, to measure time, to harness the floodwaters of great rivers. But knowledge alone does not create civilization. People do. And in the earliest towns and cities, humanity began the long experiment of coexistence. Imagine dawn in ancient Sumer. The air is cool, the light still golden on the mud brick walls. Women draw water from the communal well, their laughter echoing between narrow streets. Farmers lead oxen toward distant fields while potters roll clay on wooden boards. Smoke rises from hearths where bread bakes for the morning meal. Every sound, from the bleating of goats to the clatter of tools, becomes part of a living rhythm. Civilization is no longer an idea, it is a heartbeat. In these clustered homes, people found safety, yes, but also identity. A family was no longer just blood but structure. Grandparents, children, servants, apprentices, all tied to their craft, their gods, and their city's destiny. The household became the smallest unit of civilization, the first government of the human soul. It was here that values were taught, food was shared, and stories of ancestors kept memory alive. And beyond the threshold of each home lay the marketplace, the world's first stage. Here, language danced and coins sang. Grain, cloth, pottery, and livestock changed hands in simple exchanges that echoed the beating heart of interdependence. For the first time, humans lived in economies larger than themselves. One person's surplus became another's sustenance. The invisible thread of trade wove the fabric of early society tighter than any wall could. But life in the early city was more than labor. It was also ritual. Festivals marked the turning of seasons. Prayers rose with the sun, and music carried through courtyards at dusk. Religion and society intertwined. The divine no longer lived only in the sky, but in every act of work and worship. Temples were not just places of prayer. They were centers of administration, education, and storage. The granaries of the gods fed the people, and in return, the people fed the gods through devotion. Each civilization expressed this bond differently. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurat rose like a mountain of meaning, its steps bridging heaven and earth. In Egypt, processions wound past colossal statues and painted tombs, their rituals blending civic duty with spiritual grace. In the Indus Valley, quiet order prevailed. Streets aligned with precision, homes built with uniform care, suggesting a people governed less by kings and more by shared understanding. What united them all was rhythm, not of drums or chants, but of structure. Life had become organized, and with organization came identity. Farmers knew their fields by season, potters their craft by lineage, scribes their role by knowledge. From these roles grew hierarchy, a pattern of dependence and distinction that would shape every future civilization. And yet, beneath all hierarchy, something profoundly human endured: cooperation. No king could command the harvest alone. No priest could build a temple without workers. No artisan could thrive without buyers. Society was a circle, not a pyramid, at least at first. The earliest communities thrived because each person's contribution mattered. In these beginnings, we see not just the blueprint of government or economy, but the birth of empathy, the shared meal, the shared song, the shared grief, all threads binding humanity into something larger than survival. The city, for all its dust and noise, became an expression of the collective spirit. Humanity learning to live not as individuals, but as a single breathing organism. And as night falls, imagine walking through those ancient streets again. The market's quiet, the fires dim. Somewhere, a mother hums to her child. A scribe unrolls a tablet. A priest gazes at the stars above a sleeping city. These moments, small, fleeting, sacred, are the soul of civilization. What began with seeds in the soil and symbols on clay has now blossomed into something more profound: culture, the art of living together. Here, in this gentle awakening of the first societies, Humanity took its greatest step, not toward conquest or invention, but toward connection, toward the fragile miracle of coexistence, the hum of markets, the rhythm of shared labor, the song of belonging. This is where society began to breathe. Civilization's foundations were already set. Time was measured, writing had taken root, and fields were tamed under the rhythm of the sun. Yet for all these inventions, the most transformative creation was invisible: society itself. Humanity's greatest leap was not the building of cities or temples, but the weaving of lives into a shared fabric. From this came identity, duty, hierarchy, and belonging, the structure through which civilization began to truly breathe. The first societies did not arise by command or decree. They emerged naturally from the push and pull of human need. Kinship, the oldest institution, formed the earliest glue. In every civilization, from the Tigris to the Nile, from the Indus to the Yellow River, people lived within webs of family. Bloodline defined inheritance, responsibility, and respect. A child's future was bound not to individual ambition, but to lineage. It was through kinship that order took its first shape, long before law or government existed. In Mesopotamia, clans organized work and worship alike. The household, or was both home and enterprise, containing family, servants, animals, and workshops. Within its walls, one could hear the rhythm of grinding grain, the shaping of clay, the recitation of prayers. The same patterns echoed across the ancient world. In Egypt, the extended family worked together on royal estates. In the Indus Valley, homes opened onto shared courtyards where neighbors met daily. In China, ancestral veneration linked generations through ritual and remembrance. But as settlements grew, kinship alone could not sustain them. The world's first cities demanded coordination beyond blood. Division of labor became the silent architecture holding society together. One person became a potter, another a weaver, another a scribe or trader or soldier. Specialization was born, not from luxury, but from necessity. In Uruk, Sumer's great city, thousands worked without ever meeting, each contributing to a system larger than themselves. The farmer's harvest filled the granaries that fed the builders, whose temples honored the gods that promised fertility to the fields. It was a circle of dependence, perfected through repetition and faith. In Egypt, artisans carved monuments under the supervision of scribes and overseers, while peasants turned the rhythm of the Nile into a predictable economy. In the Indus Valley, standardization reached astonishing precision. Brick sizes, weights, and measures were uniform across hundreds of miles, hinting at shared governance through consistency rather than command. This new division of labor carried an unseen transformation: the birth of class. What had once been a community of equals now began to stratify. Those who managed the flow of goods, knowledge, and belief slowly rose above those who toiled in the fields. Scribes, priests, and administrators, masters of symbols, became the interpreters of reality itself. They recorded debts, charted stars, and defined divine will. Power began to take root not in strength, but in literacy, ritual, and access to the unseen. In every early civilization, this hierarchy reflected both function and faith. To the Sumerians, kings ruled as chosen stewards of the gods. In Egypt, the pharaoh was himself divine. In China, the emperor held the mandate of heaven, a cosmic legitimacy that bound earth to sky. Even the more egalitarian Indus culture, where no royal palaces or grand tombs have been found, likely carried its own social distinctions through craft and occupation. The difference was that hierarchy was still sacred, understood as part of nature's order, rather than an invention of man. And yet, beneath all order, life pulsed with ordinary rhythm. Daily existence in the first societies was not one of grand palaces or proclamations, but of shared human moments. The scribe's weary hand at twilight, the farmer's laughter as the rains returned, the mother whispering prayers to protect her children. These were the quiet constants that gave civilization meaning. Religion, too, transformed under the weight of social organization. Gods became reflections of societal structure, complex, ordered, and hierarchical. Pantheons mirrored bureaucracies, Each deity had a role, each temple its duty. Worship was no longer spontaneous, it was administered. In Sumer, temple economies collected offerings, stored surplus grain, and redistributed wealth. In Egypt, the priesthood guarded sacred texts and celestial knowledge, preserving the rhythm of ritual that tied cosmic balance to political stability. In China, rituals honored not only gods but ancestors, ensuring continuity between the living and the dead. The sacred and the social had become one. The emergence of artisans marked another quiet revolution. For the first time, beauty became labor. Craftsmen shaped clay, stone, and metal, not just for function, but for form, giving expression to communal identity. Jewelry, seals, pottery, and murals spoke in symbols long before words could. The artisan's workshop was both economic and spiritual, a space where work became creation and creation became devotion. Markets expanded this artistry into exchange. In every ancient city, there were meeting places where goods changed hands and stories were shared. These were not merely economic hubs, they were social theaters. Here, strangers met, languages blended, and customs crossed. A pot from Sumer might end up in Anatolia. A bead from the Indus might travel to Mesopotamia. Trade carried not just goods, but ideas, silently binding distant peoples into a single conversation. Law soon followed trade. The more people interacted, the greater the need for rules beyond family or faith. The earliest codes, like those of Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi, were attempts to formalize fairness, to define justice as something greater than personal revenge. Carved into stone, law became an early promise between ruler and ruled, the acknowledgement that even power must answer to principle. But civilization's balance was delicate. The same systems that fostered unity also sowed division. Surplus created wealth and inequality. Urban life offered stability and confinement. Literacy brought knowledge and control. For every advancement, a shadow followed. Society's order depended on invisible compromises, labor extracted from the many to sustain the few, belief shaped to preserve obedience. And yet, even within these structures, humanity's heart continued to beat, stubbornly, vividly. In the courtyards of Ur, children played with clay toys. In Egyptian villages, workers told jokes about their overseers. In the Indus Valley, people built bathrooms with drainage systems so refined they would not be matched for millennia. Civilization, for all its formality, remained a profoundly human creation, filled with laughter, frustration, ambition, and grace. As societies matured, they learned to see themselves as more than a collection of individuals. Collective identity, the sense of us, took hold. Myths, festivals, and shared rituals turned memory into belonging. A Babylonian might say, "We are the people of Marduk." An Egyptian might declare, "We live under Ra's light." These identities outlived any ruler or dynasty, echoing across time as the cultural DNA of civilization itself. The story of the first societies, then, is not simply one of structure. It is the story of balance between cooperation and control, between individuality and community, between freedom and order. Humanity, in its attempt to organize the world, discovered both unity and complexity. From kinship grew community, from labor, purpose, from faith, meaning, and from shared identity, civilization itself. As we move deeper into Act 2 of Sleepless Timelines, we descend further into daily life, the markets, the families, the rituals that sustained the ancient city's heartbeat. Civilization was no longer just an achievement. It was a condition of being human. And it is here in the stories of workers and weavers, scribes and priests, farmers and dreamers, that the true spirit of early civilization lives on. In every rule kept every task repeated and every gesture of connection that built the first human societies. Civilization began not with kings or temples, but with families. The household was humanity's first institution, older than law, older than gods written in stone. Within its walls, the rhythms of life found their shape. Every meal prepared, every tool crafted, every child raised, These were the invisible bricks that held the world together. When archaeologists sift through the remains of ancient cities, shards of pottery, hearthstones, spindle whorls, fragments of bone, they are peering into the architecture of kinship. In places like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, one of the earliest known urban settlements, homes were packed tightly together, each one a near mirror of the next. There were no palaces or streets, no formal hierarchy carved into the clay. Families entered their homes from rooftops, moving across a maze of flat terraces like bees in a hive. Each dwelling was a world of its own, walls plastered and painted with images of bulls and hunters, the echoes of a shared mythology whispered through domestic ritual. Here, the household was not just a space of rest. It was the factory of survival. Women ground grain on heavy querns, their arms shaping muscle through repetition. Men repaired tools or managed flocks. Children learned by imitation, not from instruction, but through presence. Knowledge passed from gesture to gesture, from the rhythm of daily work. In such places, the family was not a private sphere as we imagine it today. It was the foundation of economic and spiritual life alike. As agriculture deepened its roots, kinship became the mechanism for organization. Fields needed to be planted, harvested, defended, and the cooperation of extended families was essential. The earliest records from Mesopotamia show that land was often worked by kin-based units, each family responsible for their portion of the collective yield. Grain surpluses, livestock counts, and debts were tracked not by state accountants, but by patriarchs and matriarchs, keeping tally on clay tokens. Society was still small enough for memory to serve as ledger. But as generations passed and communities expanded, families became the threads of a growing social fabric. Marriage alliances linked households into clans, and clans into tribes. These ties could mean survival or ruin. In ancient Sumer, lineage determined status and inheritance. The son of a craftsman might inherit his father's trade, while the son of a priest could inherit privilege and access. By the time writing emerged, family records were being etched into clay to preserve the continuity of property and bloodline. In Egypt, family carried both sacred and economic significance. The household gods, Bez, protector of childbirth, and Taweret, guardian of mothers, watched over domestic spaces with the same gravity as Ra did over the sky. Every Egyptian home had a small shrine, where offerings were made not to grand deities but to ancestors. The living maintained bonds with the dead, believing that neglecting one's lineage could invite misfortune. In this way, family became a spiritual contract extending beyond death, a pattern echoed in countless cultures across time. In the Indus Valley, domestic life took on a distinctly urban shape. Archaeological excavations at Mohenjo-Daro reveal standardized brick houses with private wells and drainage systems, evidence of a civilization that valued hygiene, routine, and shared responsibility. The city itself was an extended household, neighborhoods grouped by craft or kinship, each family's labor feeding into the broader rhythm of collective order. Women's bangles, toys, and small terracotta figurines hint at a society that balanced practicality with artistry. Kinship also governed inheritance and identity in early China. The Jia, the household, was the nucleus of Confucian order long before Confucius himself. Family elders wielded authority not by coercion, but by moral example. Ancestors were venerated through carefully timed rites, linking the living and the dead in a continuous chain of duty and remembrance. A man's reputation, his capacity to lead, even his right to speak, were rooted in how well he fulfilled his role within that chain. In Mesoamerica, family extended beyond blood to include guilds and ritual kinship. Among the Olmec and later the Maya, artisans and farmers formed associations bound by shared craft and mutual obligation. The concept of kinship merged with cosmology. Every household was aligned with celestial patterns, and every birth was read as part of a cosmic cycle. A child born under a particular day sign was believed to carry the energy of that celestial moment, a fate to be nurtured or guarded against through household ritual. Across continents, one truth held: the family was civilization's smallest unit of order, a microcosm of power, labor, and belief. It was within the household that gender roles solidified, that moral codes took root, that inequality began its slow creep. Patriarchal structures, though varying in form, were already emerging. In many ancient societies, women's labor sustained both home and field, yet their status was defined through marriage or motherhood. Dowries, bride prices, and inheritance laws would soon bind economics to gender, turning the household from a cooperative space into a regulated hierarchy. Yet, even in this evolution, the household remained a sanctuary. In Mesopotamian texts, the home was called Egal, literally, the great house, the same word used for palaces and temples. To maintain one's household was a moral act, as sacred as tending the gods. In the Hebrew Bible, the wisdom literature echoes this sentiment. Through wisdom is a house built, and by understanding it is established. The metaphor of the home became a symbol for civilization itself, the ordered shelter against chaos. Trade and urbanization would eventually pull the household outward, connecting it to markets and states, but even then, its rhythms endured. The family meal, the shared labor, the ritual of morning and evening. These were humanity's first institutions of timekeeping, long before mechanical clocks. Each family's survival depended on synchronization with the seasons and with each other. In the end, every palace and temple stood on the foundation of 1,000 homes, homes filled with the smell of bread, the sound of grinding stone, the murmur of prayer. To understand civilization's grandeur, one must first understand its most intimate architecture, the family hearth. The household was more than a roof over one's head. It was where identity was shaped, where memory was stored, where the earliest codes of ethics were written, not on tablets, but in the quiet repetitions of care and labor. Civilization, for all its monuments and rulers, was built one home at a time. If the household was the seed of civilization, labor was its soil, rich, uneven, and shaped by countless hands. Once humanity learned to settle, to sow, and to harvest, work ceased to be a matter of survival alone. It became the rhythm of existence, the force that defined identity, and eventually, the axis around which power revolved. In the earliest agricultural societies, labor was communal. Farmers worked side by side, guided by the cycles of the sun and the flooding of rivers. The Nile, the Tigris, the Indus, each demanded a collective choreography of effort. Irrigation ditches had to be dug, canals maintained, levees repaired. The harvest was shared because failure in one field could mean hunger for all. In this interdependence, the first sense of civic duty was born, the understanding that one's labor was part of something larger than the self. But as surpluses grew, so too did specialization. In Sumer, the floodplains of Mesopotamia became a stage for economic differentiation. Not everyone needed to farm. Some became potters, weavers, smiths, and builders, trades that required skill and consistency. These artisans gave cities like Uruk and Lagash their physical texture, bricks baked in the sun, reed boats stitched together for trade, jewelry inlaid with lapis lazuli and gold. Every craft was an act of devotion as much as utility, each worker a silent participant in a divine economy. Still, this division of labor sowed hierarchy. Those who could control the products of others' hands soon controlled society itself. At first it was the temple, the spiritual and administrative heart of the city. Priests managed granaries, supervised irrigation, recorded transactions, and declared when it was time to plant or reap. The gods' favor became the currency of rule. In the great ziggurats of Sumer, priests stood between heaven and earth, interpreters of cosmic will and custodians of human effort. Labor was sanctified through ritual, and obedience became divine duty. From this sacred bureaucracy, kingship emerged. Early rulers did not claim to be gods, but rather chosen stewards, mediators of balance between chaos and order. In Egypt, the pharaoh was both priest and sovereign, his authority justified by Ma'at, the principle of cosmic harmony. Farmers along the Nile paid taxes in grain and labor, building not only their own sustenance, but the monuments of eternity. The Great Pyramids, though symbols of divine kingship, were also monuments to organized labor. Thousands of workers coordinated through a vast logistical network of food, housing, and oversight. Contrary to myth, these workers were not slaves in the brutal sense, but rather conscripted citizens performing service during the flood season when fields lay underwater. Labor in Egypt was both duty and identity. The stonemason, the scribe, the brewer, the washerman, all were recorded in hieroglyphic murals, celebrated and admonished in wisdom texts. "Do not be idle, for labor is the foundation of the world," reads one such inscription. To work was to belong, but class was beginning to crystallize. As storage facilities multiplied and temples amassed wealth, control of resources concentrated in fewer hands.
In Mesopotamia, the temple estates owned vast tracts of land, leasing them to tenant farmers who owed rent in grain. The bureaucracy expanded. Scribes, overseers, tax collectors, each layer insulated from the toil below. Labor had become stratified, physical work at the bottom, intellectual and ritual work at the top. This pattern echoed across early civilizations. In the Indus Valley, standardized weights and measures suggest an organized economy with craft guilds and regulated trade.
Yet, within those cleanly planned streets of Mohenjo-Daro, inequality whispered between the bricks. Larger homes clustered near central drains, while smaller dwellings lined the peripheries. The very infrastructure of the city encoded class, not through monuments, but through plumbing. In China, under the early dynasties, labor was seen as a moral obligation to the collective. Farmers were idealized in Confucian texts as the backbone of virtue, yet they bore the heaviest burdens. Taxes in kind, corvée labor for dikes and roads, and military conscription all fell upon them. Above them stood the artisans, respected but bound to their craft, and the scholars and priests who claimed to interpret the mandate of heaven. When floods or famines struck, rulers faced moral judgment, for imbalance in labor and land was seen as cosmic disorder. Even in the Americas, the structure of work mirrored faith. Among the Maya, labor was inseparable from religion. Farmers planted maize according to celestial calendars, artisans carved temples that aligned with solstices, and rulers staged rituals to ensure the world's renewal. Every act of work was an offering, a reaffirmation of humanity's role in sustaining the universe. Over time, labor and class became codified into law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of history's first written legal systems, defines wages for laborers, rights of artisans, and penalties for negligence. If a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, that builder shall be put to death. Justice itself was measured in work and consequence. These early laws not only protected property but reinforced hierarchy. The free man, the dependent, the slave, each had their defined worth in silver and grain. And yet, even within this order, there were moments of resistance and adaptation. Workers' strikes are recorded as early as 1150 BCE in Egypt, when artisans at Deir el-Medina, builders of royal tombs, stopped work to protest delayed rations. Their voices, preserved in papyrus, reveal an early consciousness of dignity, a recognition that labor, though bound by hierarchy, carried its own moral power. In every society, labor shaped the rhythm of the day and the architecture of belief. Farmers looked to the heavens for guidance, artisans to the city for patronage, priests to the gods for legitimacy, and rulers to their subjects for sustenance. The cycle was reciprocal yet fragile. When one link faltered, a failed harvest, a corrupt temple, a ruler out of favor, the entire structure trembled. Artisans gave civilization its form, but priests gave it meaning, and rulers gave it order. Farmers sustained them all. This web of interdependence became the essence of class, not merely a division of wealth, but of worldview. The farmer saw the soil as sacred duty, the priest saw it as divine reflection, the ruler saw it as dominion. Labor was not just an economic activity, it was a philosophy of existence, each role tethered to a vision of cosmic balance. By the late Bronze Age, this balance began to strain. Cities grew wealthier, palaces larger, temples more elaborate. The distance between ruler and laborer widened into a chasm bridged only by ritual and belief. Yet beneath the glittering facades of early civilization, it was still the anonymous hands of farmers, artisans, and builders that held everything upright. Civilization had learned how to organize work, but not yet how to make it just. The lessons of labor, its dignity, its inequality, its power to create and destroy, would echo for millennia. For in the story of class, humanity learned both cooperation and conflict, the two eternal gears of progress. Civilization did not emerge as a single voice. It was a chorus, one where men and women shaped the world together, though history often remembered only half the song. In the ruins of ancient cities from the banks of the Nile to the plains of the Indus, we can still trace the fingerprints of both. A shared authorship of the earliest human order, divided not just by task, but by meaning. In the dawn of settled life, gender was not yet hierarchy. Among early agricultural villages like Çatalhöyük, archaeologists find no palaces, no temples, no signs of kings, only homes adorned with art, altars, and clay figurines. Men hunted and built, women gathered, ground grain, raised children, and tended fields. The work was interwoven, each dependent on the other's rhythm. Power flowed through household and hearth, not throne and crown. It was in these early communities that fertility and creation became sacred. The female form, carved in stone or molded in clay, represented abundance. These were not idols of subservience, but emblems of continuity, the eternal cycle of life. The so-called mother goddess figurines, with their rounded bodies and serene faces, tell of a world that understood women as keepers of both survival and spirit. But as societies grew complex, as labor specialized and surpluses accumulated, gender began to separate along lines of visibility and control. Men moved into public roles: irrigation, trade, warfare, and priesthood. Women, still vital to the economy, became increasingly confined to domestic and ritual spheres. The shift was not sudden. It was gradual, unfolding across centuries as the management of property replaced the sharing of it. In Sumer, one of the earliest civilizations, women held notable power at first. They owned land, ran businesses, and served as priestesses in temples dedicated to goddesses like Inanna, the divine embodiment of love and war. High priestesses were among the most educated figures in early Mesopotamia, and Hedwana, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, stands as the world's first known author, composing hymns that unified an empire through poetry and devotion. Yet even as she wrote, the foundation of patriarchy was hardening beneath her words. By the Old Babylonian period, laws like Hammurabi's Code reflected an emerging male authority over household and property. Women could still inherit and engage in contracts, but their autonomy was increasingly regulated. Marriage became both social institution and economic alliance, a transaction that tied lineage, wealth, and legitimacy together. Gender, once a partnership of necessity, was now a mechanism of order. Egypt offered a more balanced model, though not an equal one. The Nile Valley's stability allowed for a different rhythm of life. Women could own land, manage estates, and act in legal affairs without a male guardian, a rarity in the ancient world. Queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertari wielded visible power, not as anomalies, but as extensions of divine legitimacy. The goddess Isis herself symbolized wisdom, magic, and maternal strength, a reminder that power in Egypt was not solely masculine, but dual, mirroring the harmony of Mayat, cosmic balance. Still, Egyptian society divided labor by gender. Men worked as scribes, soldiers, and builders. Women brewed beer, wove linen, and prepared offerings for the dead. The temple was both a workplace and a theater of gendered roles. Priests chanted hymns to male gods, while priestesses tended shrines to Hathor or Nephthys. Each gender carried its ritual weight, and both were bound by the same cosmic duty: to sustain order through service. In the Indus Valley, where writing remains undeciphered, the story of gender survives through artifacts. Small terracotta figurines of women, sometimes adorned with jewelry or headdresses, suggest a society that venerated fertility and household prosperity. Yet the absence of monumental kingship hints at a more diffused balance of power, one in which gender may have been cooperative rather than hierarchical. The standardized homes, drains, and granaries of Mohenjo-Daro speak of collective discipline rather than individual domination. China's earliest dynasties, however, reveal a more formal stratification. The oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang mention queens and consorts who acted as intermediaries with the divine. Lady Fu Hao, both priestess and military commander, led troops into battle and performed state rituals. Her tomb, filled with weapons, jade, and bronze, attests to a life of extraordinary agency. Yet by the Zhou dynasty, Confucian ideals began to codify the subordination of women under patriarchal ethics. Order required hierarchy, and hierarchy required distinction. The family became a mirror of the cosmos. Father is heaven, mother is earth, complementary but unequal. Across the Atlantic, among the early Mesoamerican civilizations, gender and ritual intertwined in yet another form. The Maya conceived the cosmos as a balance of masculine and feminine forces, sky and earth, day and night, life and death. Women played vital roles in agriculture and ceremony, weaving textiles that encoded mythic patterns and participating in rites tied to fertility and renewal. Power was spiritual, not political, yet deeply respected. In every culture, production and ritual reflected gender's invisible contract with power. Men built walls and tilled soil. Women made bread and lineage. But beneath these divisions lay something deeper, an exchange of continuity. The labor of women sustained the rhythm of home. The labor of men, the rhythm of the state. Together they formed the unseen machinery of civilization. Religion often sanctified these roles. Goddesses personified fertility, harvest, and love. Ishtar, Isis, Demeter, and Inanna, while gods embodied war, justice, and creation. Yet as empires grew, the divine hierarchy shifted to mirror earthly kingship. Male gods ascended, goddesses became consorts or symbols. Power centralized, both in heaven and on earth. And yet, in quiet corners of daily life, women's influence endured. In every civilization, they were the teachers of continuity, the keepers of oral tradition, medicine, and domestic technology. Midwives, healers, and weavers held knowledge as vital as any scribe's tablet. Their power was not proclaimed, it was lived. Civilization depended on it, even when it refused to name it. The relationship between gender and power is one of civilization's oldest tensions. It shaped law, myth, and morality. Who could speak? Who could inherit? Who could lead? But in every age, exceptions broke through. A queen built temples. A priestess wrote hymns. A healer whispered wisdom that kings could not command. In the story of gender, civilization learned that power wears many forms, visible and hidden, sacred and practical. Every plowed field and woven garment, every hymn and stone monument carries both signatures, the masculine hand that built and the feminine hand that gave it life. The story of civilization's rise is, in many ways, the story of trade, the quiet, ceaseless current that bound one village to another, one people to the next. Long before empires, armies, or written law, there were markets, places where strangers met to barter grain for salt, cloth for copper, ideas for trust. These early exchanges were not just economic acts, they were human negotiations, of value, of culture, and of connection. In the earliest settlements, production exceeded survival. Agriculture had given humanity surplus, a revolutionary concept. No longer did every person need to hunt, gather, or sow. Some could specialize: potters, metalworkers, herders, and scribes. And when specialization flourished, so did exchange. What began as neighborly barter grew into networks of dependency, a farmer trading barley for a craftsman's blade, a herder swapping wool for oil. Archaeology tells us that these simple exchanges carried profound consequences. In Mesopotamia, clay tokens, small geometric shapes, were used to represent quantities of goods in trade. Over time, these tokens evolved into impressions on clay tablets, giving rise to the world's first written contracts. Writing itself, one might say, was born not in temples or palaces, but in the marketplace. By 3000 BCE, cities like Uruk had become centers of organized commerce. Merchants recorded shipments of barley, wool, and silver under temple oversight. The economy was both spiritual and practical. The gods owned the land, but the people managed it. Temple complexes acted as proto-banks, storing grain and redistributing resources. Laborers received rations recorded in cuneiform ledgers, while caravans carried Mesopotamian textiles and pottery as far as Anatolia and the Levant. Trade demanded infrastructure, not roads of asphalt, but pathways of trust. Merchants relied on family connections, local brokers, and temple priests to ensure fair dealing. Debt existed, as did credit. Interest rates were recorded centuries before coins were minted. The clay tablets of Sumer show receipts, contracts, and disputes. Evidence of a system already aware that prosperity required accountability. Egypt, meanwhile, traded along the life-giving Nile. Barges loaded with grain, gold, and papyrus glided between nomes, each governed by local officials who managed the flow of resources. The Nile was not merely a river. It was a marketplace in motion, carrying the wealth of one region to another. Beyond Egypt's borders, expeditions traveled to Punt for incense, to Nubia for gold, and across the Sinai for copper. The Pharaoh's economy was both divine and mercantile, a reflection of cosmic order expressed through material abundance. In the Indus Valley, commerce reached a remarkable level of sophistication. Standardized weights and measures, uniform seals, and extensive trade networks suggest a culture deeply attuned to precision and fairness. Archaeologists have found Indus seals as far west as Mesopotamia, marked with animals and symbols that likely identified merchants or families. Goods like cotton, ivory, and carnelian beads traveled through vast routes linking city to city, culture to culture. Yet, unlike in Mesopotamia or Egypt, there is no evidence of kings or tax collectors dominating these exchanges. Trade, it seems, may have been the lifeblood of a society governed more by cooperation than coercion. In China's early dynasties, barter defined the local economy. Farmers traded grain and silk for bronze tools or ritual vessels. Marketplaces sprouted near city gates, where overseers collected levies for the state. By the Zhou dynasty, the first forms of currency appeared, cowrie shells used as units of value, later evolving into bronze replicas cast by royal decree. Commerce became a reflection of cosmic harmony, guided by ritual propriety and moral order. To trade fairly was not merely economic virtue, it was alignment with heaven's balance. But it was in Mesopotamia that we see the first glimpses of long-distance trade shaping diplomacy itself. Merchants became ambassadors. Caravans carried not only goods but stories, customs, and myths. Tin from the Zagros Mountains, copper from Cyprus, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all converged in cities that pulsed with foreign accents and ambitions. Trade was globalization's first whisper. In these exchanges, markets were more than economic spaces. They were social theaters. Here, farmers met artisans, travelers met priests, and ideas moved as freely as spices or metals. Markets became the great equalizer, where wealth could rise from wit, not birth. Yet they were also the crucible of inequality. As some prospered, others borrowed, and debt gave rise to power. The merchant's freedom became the ruler's leverage. Over time, these humble markets birthed entire systems of governance. Taxation emerged, the ruler's share of the public's prosperity. Temples collected offerings not only for gods, but for the redistribution of goods. The act of exchange, once personal, became institutional, and in doing so, it created accountability, a record, a standard, a law. The symbolism of trade even entered religion. In Sumer, the god Enki was patron of both wisdom and commerce, a divine reminder that knowledge and exchange were inseparable. In Egypt, Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance, presided over scales, the same symbol used to weigh grain and gold. To cheat in trade was not merely dishonor, it was sacrilege, a disruption of cosmic order. Markets evolved from open squares to covered stalls, from seasonal fairs to permanent districts. In Babylon, bazaars stretched along canals, selling everything from linen and spices to livestock and jewelry. Prices fluctuated with the harvest, and scribes kept meticulous notes on grain values, the earliest evidence of economic observation. Trade was becoming abstract, measurable, a rhythm not unlike the calendars that preceded it. With exchange came specialization, and with specialization, dependency. Civilizations could no longer exist in isolation. Tin and copper combined to make bronze, the alloy that defined an age. One region's strength depended on another's resource, binding humanity in an invisible web of mutual need. This web, fragile, expansive, and dynamic, became the first network of civilization. Even beyond material goods, trade carried intangible wealth. Words, technologies, and beliefs traveled alongside merchants. The wheel, writing, and metallurgy spread not by conquest, but by curiosity and necessity. In marketplaces, one could hear the blending of dialects, see the borrowing of styles, taste the merging of cultures. Civilization was no longer local, it was shared. Yet for all its promise, trade also carried risk. Caravans could be robbed, merchants cheated, goods spoiled. To trade was to trust, and to risk loss. That uncertainty gave rise to the first legal protections, contracts, and guarantees. Civilization began to define fairness, obligation, and consequence through the language of commerce. By the late Bronze Age, markets were microcosms of empire. Egyptian merchants negotiated with Levantine traders. Babylonian silver flowed through Anatolian hands. Chinese bronze reached distant tribes. The hum of trade had become the heartbeat of civilization. Its pulse measured not in crops or conquests, but in exchange. The marketplace was where humanity learned the most enduring lesson of civilization. That survival is not merely about possession, but participation. To trade is to acknowledge another's value, to see worth in what is not your own. From the first handful of barley swapped beside a riverbank to the bustling bazaars of Babylon, markets transformed humanity's understanding of connection. They turned isolation into interdependence, and through that, they gave rise to something larger, the global imagination of civilization itself. As civilization found its rhythm, people began to measure time not just by harvests and floods, but by moments of joy, by the heartbeat of the collective. Festivals were humanity's earliest expressions of shared meaning, where the sacred and the ordinary intertwined. What began as a prayer to ensure a good crop evolved into elaborate ceremonies of music, dance, and feasting that defined identity and belonging. In Mesopotamia, the Akitu festival of Babylon marked the new year, a 12-day renewal of cosmic order, where the king humbled himself before Marduk, the chief god. Priests recited ancient hymns that reaffirmed the world's creation, while the city's people watched processions wind through streets lined with incense and banners. For them, this was more than spectacle. It was reassurance that the heavens still favored their city, that the divine wheel continued to turn. The rituals echoed through ziggurats and courtyards, binding priest, ruler, and farmer in a single act of continuity. Egypt, too, built its calendar around celebration. The festival of Opet in Thebes united the people with their gods through procession. The statue of Amun sailed down the Nile from Karnak to Luxor as crowds sang, danced, and feasted on bread, beer, and roasted meats. It was not just religion. It was renewal, the promise of life returning with the Nile's flood. The same current that carried silt and sustenance carried meaning. People celebrated not to escape labor, but to remind themselves why they labored in the first place. Across the Indus Valley, where urban order thrived without grand palaces or kings, festivals may have been more communal. Archaeologists have found seals depicting dance, drumming, and animal symbolism, clues to a world where spirituality was woven into domestic life. Rituals likely honored fertility, rainfall, and household deities rather than distant monarchs. These were local celebrations, not displays of hierarchy, but affirmations of balance. Even in early China, under the Shang and Zhou dynasties, ritual was the backbone of civilization. Ancestor veneration linked families to the cosmos. Great ceremonies involving oracle bones, bronze vessels, and music were acts of maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. To neglect ritual was to invite disorder, not only in politics, but in the natural world. Thus, the emperor became not merely a ruler, but a conductor of the divine rhythm, ensuring that the celestial order flowed through human society. What unites all these traditions is the idea that celebration was not leisure. It was labor of a higher kind, the work of faith, of renewal, of social unity. The energy spent in preparing offerings, crafting costumes, and rehearsing songs was itself a form of devotion. To celebrate was to reaffirm belonging to one's people, gods, and time. Music and dance were central. In Sumer, temple musicians and dancers were trained professionals attached to the household of the gods. Their movements carried meaning, a language of rhythm and gesture that invoked divine presence. In Egypt, temple dancers performed sacred choreography before idols, while harps, flutes, and drums turned ceremony into symphony. These arts blurred the line between entertainment and worship. The joy of rhythm became proof that the divine was near. Food, too, was symbolic. Feasts in the ancient world were acts of generosity that dissolved boundaries. In some Mesopotamian festivals, priests distributed bread and beer to the poor. Offerings meant for the gods but shared among the people. In early Greece, this would evolve into the communal meal of the polis, a prototype of civic life itself. To eat together was to remember that survival was collective. The social purpose of festivals cannot be overstated. They were moments when hierarchies softened, when rulers and subjects, rich and poor, stood side by side beneath the same banners. Even when power remained unequal, the illusion of unity was powerful. The king's presence among his people reaffirmed legitimacy. The people's joy reaffirmed consent. In that mutual exchange, society breathed. But festivals were also instruments of control. In Babylon, the Akitu reaffirmed the king's divine right. In Rome, later Saturnalia blurred class lines only to restore them again. The rhythm of celebration and restraint created a cycle that mirrored natural order. Chaos followed by renewal, tension followed by peace. Through ritual, power disguised itself as harmony. Still, within that framework, real emotion thrived. Ancient hymns and songs, fragments of which survive, speak of longing, gratitude, and awe. When the people of Ur sang to Inanna, goddess of love and war, their voices carried across centuries. Lady of the morning, great is your light over the lands. Such words reveal that festivals were not cold ceremony, but vibrant dialogue between humanity and the unseen. Archaeological remains, drums, lyres, votive figurines, remind us that even in eras defined by toil and scarcity, humans found time to celebrate. To sing was to transcend survival. To dance was to momentarily escape hierarchy. To gather was to affirm the miracle of continuity in a fragile world. The festival grounds were also spaces of exchange. Markets often grew around temples, drawing traders, artisans, and travelers. Religious gatherings became economic ones, where faith met commerce and cultural exchange flourished. Ideas, goods, and styles crossed borders under the banner of devotion. The rhythm of celebration became the rhythm of civilization itself. When night fell after a festival day, fires flickered in courtyards, shadows danced on walls, and the scent of incense lingered. People rested knowing the gods had been honored. The calendar reset, the bonds of community renewed. Tomorrow would bring labor again. But tonight, they had glimpsed eternity. In this fusion of faith and festivity, early societies built something enduring, the conviction that joy itself could be sacred, that to dance, to feast, and to gather was to echo creation. Through celebration, humanity learned not only to mark time, but to make meaning of it. Civilization's greatest invention was not the plow or the wheel, it was the rule. When humans began to live together in large permanent settlements, the fragile balance of cooperation demanded something stronger than kinship or trust. It demanded law, the unseen architecture that kept thousands of strangers from tearing each other apart. Law transformed the village into the city, the family into the state, and power into legitimacy. In the beginning, justice was personal. In early farming communities, wrongs were settled by elders, and punishment often meant repayment, grain for grain, cattle for cattle. But as populations swelled, disputes multiplied. Who owned which field? Who was responsible for a collapsed wall, a broken contract, a stolen goat? The oral traditions that once governed life could no longer keep pace. Words alone could fade. The written word, however, endured. And with it came the birth of codified justice. Nowhere is this more vividly preserved than in ancient Mesopotamia. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 BCE, stands as the earliest known law code. It laid down fines for injuries, punishments for theft, and protection for widows and orphans. but it was Hammurabi's code, carved into basalt around 1750 BCE, that marked the full emergence of law as a foundation of civilization. Standing over 7 feet tall, the stele depicts Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god and divine judge. Beneath that image, nearly 300 laws cover every aspect of life: property, trade, marriage, labor, and crime. Its preamble begins not with rules, but with purpose: to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. In these words, we glimpse a timeless tension between justice as moral ideal and justice as tool of control. Hammurabi's code sought fairness, but it also solidified hierarchy. The punishments differed depending on class. For a noble, a fine; for a slave, death. Equality before the law was still centuries away, but the idea that law should exist, that it should bind ruler and subject alike, was revolutionary. Egypt, too, understood the law as divine balance. The concept of ma'at, truth, order, and harmony, governed both the cosmos and the court. The pharaoh, embodiment of ma'at, was the living source of justice. Yet, beneath him, local courts handled disputes over property and inheritance with remarkable regularity. Papyrus records show neighbors suing over boundary stones, laborers appealing for unpaid wages, even peasants petitioning against corrupt officials. These fragments reveal a society where even the humblest citizen believed in the system power, or at least in the possibility of being heard. In the Indus Valley, though no written laws survive, the uniformity of weights, measures, and city planning suggests a society disciplined by regulation. The straight streets of Mohenjo-Daro, the standardized bricks, the sophisticated drainage, all imply a civic code enforced by shared agreement, not fear. Here, law may have been less about punishment and more about precision, an early form of social engineering where order itself was the law. China's earliest dynasties also saw the marriage of morality and authority. The mandate of heaven defined legitimacy. Rulers governed only so long as they maintained cosmic harmony. When floods, famines, or rebellions erupted, it meant heaven had withdrawn its favor. Law was thus not just human decree, it was divine alignment. Later, under the Zhou and Qin, legalism would rise, replacing moral persuasion with strict enforcement. For the legalists, virtue was unreliable, only fear maintained order. Their codes were severe but efficient, uniting vast territories through the cold precision of written rules. Across civilizations, the written contract became the lifeblood of trust. Clay tablets from Sumer record business deals, land leases, and marriage agreements sealed before witnesses. Each transaction was a small act of civilization, an assertion that words could replace violence, that symbols pressed into clay could hold men accountable. The concept of contract, born from these early records, would outlast empires. But law was never just bureaucracy, it was theater. In ancient courts, justice was performed, public, ceremonial, meant to be seen. The steles of Babylon, the papyrus scrolls of Egypt, the oracle bones of China, all carried the same message: authority flows from order. The visual spectacle of judgment reinforced faith in the system. The accused stood before the crowd, oaths were sworn before gods, punishments executed for all to witness. It was morality turned spectacle, designed to remind citizens that chaos lay only a heartbeat away. Law also carried the burden of morality. In early myths, justice was personified: Shamash in Mesopotamia, Ma'at in Egypt, Themis in Greece. These deities stood between gods and men, ensuring the universe remained balanced. To violate law was not just a crime, it was sacrilege. Every thief, every liar, every unjust ruler threatened cosmic stability. Justice, therefore, became both shield and sword, protecting order while justifying punishment. The evolution of punishment reveals much about society's values. Early systems often relied on restitution, repayment to restore balance. But as states grew stronger, punishment shifted toward deterrence, physical and public, meant to instill fear. Hammurabi's eye for an eye principle was less about cruelty than about proportionality, a primitive fairness that echoed into modern jurisprudence. In Egypt, exile or forced labor often replaced execution, reflecting a culture more concerned with cosmic purity than vengeance. Meanwhile, in China, mutilation and death were seen as necessary to preserve the moral body of the state. Justice also had a softer side: mediation. In Mesopotamian villages, elders still resolved minor disputes informally. In Egypt, petitions could appeal directly to officials for mercy. The idea of plea existed long before modern courts. These traditions acknowledged that while law must be written, fairness must be felt. Religion and law, too, were inseparable. Oaths invoked gods as witnesses. Temples held archives of contracts. To break a contract was to offend the divine. The temple and the courtroom often stood side by side. Sometimes they were the same building. Priests acted as judges, scribes as lawyers, kings as final arbiters. Justice was never independent. It was always entwined with power. Yet this fusion gave law its authority. The sacred made the social binding. And so, law became a mirror, reflecting both a society's ideals and its inequalities. It codified compassion and cruelty alike, ensuring stability even when fairness faltered. But for all its rigidity, law also carried hope. The belief that order was possible, that right could triumph over might. When archaeologists unearth tablets of ancient decrees, they are not just reading rules. They are reading a civilization's conscience, its attempt to make morality tangible, permanent, enforceable. The words etched in stone were promises whispered to eternity, that humans, though fallible, could imagine justice. And that imagination, that longing for fairness amid chaos, is what made civilization endure. Civilization depended not only on memory, but on continuity. Every generation had to learn what the last had mastered: how to farm, to build, to worship, to count, to rule. Knowledge was the invisible architecture holding everything together. Without it, even the grandest city would crumble within a lifetime. The story of early education, then, is the story of how humanity learned to teach itself. Long before schools, learning was an act of observation. A child watched his father carve stone, his mother weave cloth, his elders offer sacrifices to the gods. In this slow apprenticeship of sight and repetition, skill became inheritance. Knowledge was not written, it was performed. It lived in the body, in gesture and rhythm, in the way a potter's hand turned clay or a shepherd read the wind. This was humanity's first curriculum: experience. As societies grew more complex, so did the need for structure. In Sumer and Babylon, where writing first bloomed, education became institutionalized. The Aduba, the tablet house, was the earliest known school. Here, young scribes spent years mastering cuneiform, memorizing lists of words, gods, professions, and trades. Discipline was harsh. Clay tablets record students complaining of beatings and endless copying exercises. Yet from these rigorous halls came the scribes who ran empires, men who managed accounts, drafted decrees, and preserved myth. Literacy was not universal, but where it existed, it was power. Egypt followed a similar path. The house of life within temple complexes served as centers of learning, combining religious instruction with practical knowledge: medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and law. Scribes there were revered as servants of the gods, for they alone could record the will of Pharaoh and the rituals that kept the cosmos in balance. To write was to participate in creation itself. Hieroglyphs were not mere letters, they were sacred images, each stroke a whisper of divinity. The student scribe thus learned not just technique, but sanctity. In the Indus Valley, while no written records of schooling survive, the uniformity of their measurements, city grids, and craftsmanship suggests a deeply trained and disciplined society. Skills in metallurgy, seal carving, and construction must have been passed through long apprenticeships. In every workshop, a young hand mirrored an older one, repeating movements until mastery became instinct. Knowledge here was artisanal, rooted in materials and motion, more tactile than textual. Ancient China brought a new dimension: moral education. During the Zhou and later dynasties, teaching extended beyond skill to virtue. The family was the classroom, The father, the teacher, filial piety, obedience, respect, and duty formed the foundation of learning. Knowledge without virtue was considered dangerous, a disruption of cosmic order. By the time of Confucius, this principle evolved into a full philosophy of education. To cultivate the self was to harmonize society. His Analects would later shape the curriculum of Imperial China for millennia, making moral refinement the highest form of study. In the Americas, the Maya and Aztecs also formalized instruction. The Aztec Calmecac trained the sons of nobles in writing, astronomy, and governance. The Telpachcali prepared commoners for military and civic life. These institutions balanced intellect and discipline, embedding education within the rhythm of duty. For the Maya, learning was celestial. Priests trained to calculate planetary cycles, to read the sacred codices, and to preserve the calendar that ordered life and ritual alike. Knowledge, in these civilizations, was not for individual advancement. It was for the preservation of cosmic harmony. Yet beyond the great temples and courts, most education remained humble, the teaching of hands and hearts. A potter's apprentice learned the patience of clay. A farmer's son learned to read the soil. A midwife passed down remedies for childbirth known only through generations of care. This was the quiet genius of early civilization, the knowledge that stayed alive without ever being written. Apprenticeship was the bridge between childhood and citizenship. In workshops of bronze and wood, master and student forged bonds that went beyond trade. The apprentice not only learned skill, but absorbed values, diligence, humility, respect for craft. Work was moral formation as much as material creation. In Mesopotamia, records of contracts between masters and apprentices reveal terms of service, duration, and even clauses for misconduct. Learning was not casual. It was a sacred commitment, a miniature reflection of social order itself. As literacy spread, education became a ladder of status. To read and write was to rise. In Babylon, scribes held positions of wealth and influence. In Egypt, they were second only to priests. A scribe's stylus became a symbol of authority, as essential as the warrior's sword. The written word could command armies, manage trade, and immortalize kings. To teach someone to write, therefore, was to grant them access to immortality, the power to be remembered. Education also shaped gender roles. In most early civilizations, formal schooling was reserved for boys, especially those destined for priesthood or administration. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that women too were educated in certain contexts. Priestesses in Sumer, female healers in Egypt, and poets like Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who composed hymns still studied today. Her writings show that learning could transcend gender when linked to divine service. Knowledge, after all, was sacred before it was political. Religion remained the heart of instruction. In temple schools, the first lessons were hymns. In shrines, the first symbols were prayers. To learn was to imitate the gods, to align one's mind with cosmic order. The earliest textbooks, lists of stars, plants, animals, and omens, reveal an education concerned not only with utility, but with wonder. Learning was a way to understand creation, to see pattern in chaos. Even mathematics and astronomy were acts of reverence, revealing the logic behind the divine. What we call education was, in truth, initiation. Each student crossed from ignorance into belonging, from solitude into civilization. The scribe, the craftsman, the priest, all were heirs to the same human impulse, to preserve and perfect what had been discovered before. Through teaching, humanity achieved what even writing alone could not. Transmission not of data, but of discipline. And so, knowledge became time's greatest survivor. Empires fell, temples crumbled, scripts vanished, but the act of teaching endured. Every civilization is, at its core, a classroom, the sum of lessons learned and lessons remembered. The farmers of Egypt who learned from the Nile, the artisans of Ur who learned from their masters, the scholars of China who learned from their ancestors, all carried forward a single idea: that wisdom, unlike wealth, multiplies when shared. To pass knowledge from one mind to another is to defy mortality. The first societies understood this instinctively. They built not only walls and laws, but systems of learning. unseen yet indestructible, through which their spirits still whisper to us. Before hospitals, before surgeons, before the language of chemistry and biology, healing was an act of faith. In the earliest civilizations, illness was not simply physical, it was moral, spiritual, even cosmic. The sick body reflected imbalance in the world. To heal, then, meant not only to treat the flesh, but to restore harmony between man, nature, and the divine. The story of medicine begins in the soil, with herbs, resins, and minerals gathered from the earth. The first healers were the observers, those who noticed that certain roots soothed pain, that specific leaves reduced fever, that honey cleansed wounds. Trial and error became tradition. Across the Nile, the Euphrates, the Indus, and the Yellow River, small discoveries became sacred practices. Yet each society built its own philosophy of healing, a unique bridge between superstition and science. In ancient Mesopotamia, medicine was inseparable from religion. The earliest cuneiform tablets describing treatment date to around 2100 BCE, and they read like a fusion of spellbook and physician's manual. The ASU, a practical healer, prescribed poultices, oils, and incantations. The Asipu, a spiritual healer, performed exorcisms to drive away the demons believed to cause disease. Diagnosis often involved divination, examining the color of a patient's skin, the pulse of the body, or even the flight of birds. The sickbed was an altar, the cure a ritual. Yet within these rituals lay real pharmacology, the use of honey, willow bark, and salt solutions, ingredients we now recognize as antiseptic and analgesic. Mesopotamia's healers may have spoken the language of gods, but their hands worked in the logic of nature. Egypt took medicine to a higher art. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, is among the oldest medical texts known, listing hundreds of remedies for ailments from toothaches to tumors. Egyptian healers understood anatomy through mummification, and their observations were astonishingly accurate. They knew the pulse corresponded to the heartbeat. They identified the brain, though they misread its purpose. They set fractures with splints, stitched wounds with linen thread, and prescribed castor oil, garlic, and honey for infections. Still, even the most skilled physician invoked deities like Sekhmet, goddess of disease and healing, or Thoth, patron of wisdom. Medicine and magic intertwined, one hand holding the scalpel, the other the amulet. In the Indus Valley, evidence of dentistry predates written history itself. At Mehrgarh, archaeologists discovered human teeth drilled with remarkable precision, dating back to 7000 BCE. This was no crude surgery. The holes show signs of careful work, suggesting pain relief or infection treatment. While no written records survive, the civilization's urban sanitation systems, complete with drains, baths, and sewage channels, point to a deep concern for public health. To the Indus people, cleanliness was prevention. The city itself was a medicine. In ancient China, health was understood as balance, the eternal dance of yin and yang. The earliest medical theories preserved in texts like the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, describe illness as the disruption of qi, the life force that flows through the body. Healing required restoring harmony through herbs, acupuncture, and disciplined living. Unlike in Mesopotamia or Egypt, Chinese medicine leaned toward natural philosophy, observation, classification, and equilibrium. The body was a reflection of the cosmos. To heal one was to realign both. The Greeks would later formalize these instincts into theory. Hippocrates, often called the father of modern medicine, broke from divine causation, insisting that disease arose from natural forces. The four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, became the guiding model for centuries. Yet even this system had roots in older thought, the balance of elements, the harmony of body and world. The physician's task was to interpret imbalance and guide the patient back to equilibrium, a continuation of the same ancient rhythm that linked the sky, the soil, and the soul. But medicine was never confined to temples or scholars. In every society, the real caretakers were often women, mothers, midwives, and herbalists. They tended wounds, delivered children, and whispered old remedies passed down through generations. In Egypt, the title Sekhmet's servant referred to women skilled in healing. In Mesopotamia, priestesses practiced herbal medicine besides spiritual rites. Their wisdom rarely found its way into stone inscriptions, yet it sustained daily life far more consistently than the grand cures of royal physicians. Healing in its truest form was communal. Superstition filled the gaps left by ignorance. Amulets guarded the sick. Charms were buried under thresholds, and prayers were carved into bowls to trap evil spirits. Yet superstition also gave comfort, a sense that suffering could be understood, that unseen forces might be appeased. For the patient in agony, belief was often as potent as balm. The line between faith and medicine blurred, not because people were foolish, but because both sought the same thing: relief, order, hope. Public health, too, emerged in surprising ways. The Indus cities built elaborate drainage. The Egyptians valued cleanliness as divine purity. The Mesopotamians maintained temple baths, and the Chinese developed herbal tonics for longevity. Even when explanations were mystical, practices were practical. Civilization began to understand that a clean body, like a well-timed harvest, could be the difference between prosperity and ruin. As empires grew, so did the institutions of healing. Temples dedicated to Asclepius in Greece, to Imhotep in Egypt, to Gula in Mesopotamia, all became ancient hospitals. Patients traveled miles to sleep within their walls, hoping for divine dreams that revealed their cure. These sanctuaries blurred the line between faith and therapy, becoming both clinics and cathedrals. A sick person did not visit a doctor. He entered a sacred dialogue between body and cosmos. Medicine also became a marker of power. Pharaohs kept their own physicians. Kings employed court healers who combined medical knowledge with political influence. To cure a ruler was to touch divinity. In contrast, the poor relied on village healers and family remedies, more vulnerable but perhaps more connected to the earth that birthed medicine in the first place. Healing reflected hierarchy. The higher one's station, the more elaborate the treatment. And yet, amid superstition and hierarchy, there were moments of startling scientific clarity. The Egyptians recognized the heart as the center of circulation. The Babylonians measured symptoms and outcomes systematically. The Chinese recorded hundreds of herbs with meticulous observation. These were not accidental insights. They were the result of centuries of watching, testing, and remembering. The ancient physician was, in essence, a scientist bound by myth, half empiricist, half priest. What unites them all is compassion, the earliest form of human science. Behind every salve and prayer lay a desire to ease pain. Healing was not only about restoring function, it was about restoring dignity. To care for the sick was to affirm the value of life itself, even when its mysteries remained unsolved. By the end of the Bronze Age, medicine stood at a threshold. It had left pure magic behind, but had not yet reached modern science. Its language was still one of gods and humors, yet its practice was deeply human, rooted in touch, in care, in the belief that life could be understood and sustained. In healing, civilization found its conscience. The same minds that mapped the stars and measured floods turned inward, toward the human body, the most intricate cosmos of all. From superstition rose curiosity, from pain, progress. And though the methods would change over millennia, the impulse would not. The unyielding desire to mend what is broken, to bring balance where there is suffering. By the time the world's first cities had taken root, architecture was no longer only about survival. It was about identity. The walls we built began to reflect who we were, what we valued, and how we lived together. Civilization's story turned from the temple and palace to the home and street, the spaces that defined ordinary life. In the fertile valleys of the Tigris, Nile, and Indus, the pulse of daily existence unfolded in the humble geometry of mud brick and timber. The architecture of early societies was not monumental. It was rhythmic, a living pattern of doors, courtyards, ovens, and rooftops. Each structure was a small reflection of a greater order. A Mesopotamian house, with its open central courtyard, mirrored the city's ziggurat at its heart. Both centers of activity and meaning, both bound by the same sense of order. In Ur and Eridu, Archaeologists found rows of houses built wall to wall, separated only by narrow lanes. Privacy was a rare luxury, sound carried easily, and neighbors were never far. The home was both sanctuary and workshop, often shared by several generations under one roof. Women ground grain and brewed beer in clay jars. Men repaired tools in shadowed corners. Life spilled into the alleys, where children played and merchants shouted their wares. Across the sea in the Indus Valley, the architecture was cleaner, more planned, as if the entire city had been designed with a ruler's precision. Streets met at right angles, and homes were built around private wells and bathing rooms, connected by covered drains that carried waste away. Even ordinary houses had brick floors and baked walls, revealing a remarkable concern for hygiene and uniformity. There was no monumental palace in Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa. Instead, there were countless similar homes, suggesting a society built less on hierarchy than on order. Meanwhile, in Egypt, homes were simpler, but deeply symbolic. The poor lived in single-room mud brick dwellings with reed roofs, while wealthier families built multi-room compounds with courtyards, storage granaries, and painted walls. The architecture reflected not just comfort but belief. Every home was a small cosmos, ordered against the chaos of the desert. Within its walls, the rhythm of daily life echoed the Nile's eternal cycle: birth, flood, and renewal. The courtyard was the nucleus of early domestic life, a space of air and light, privacy and connection. It was where bread was baked, animals were kept, and gossip flowed. Archaeological remains show altars, grindstones, and storage jars clustered around these open centers. In the evenings, as smoke from hearth fires rose into the darkening sky, families gathered to share food, stories, and prayers. The home, more than any temple, was where culture took root. But beyond the household, the street became civilization's living artery. It was the boundary between the private and public, the zone of interaction where communities truly formed. In Mesopotamian cities, streets were narrow, winding, and shaded, designed as much for protection from the sun as for movement. The closer one approached the temple precinct or market, the wider and straighter the lanes became. Urban space was a reflection of hierarchy, order radiating from the center outward, just as authority did. In contrast, the Indus cities were almost eerily modern in their planning. Archaeologists have marveled at their grid systems, paved roads, and standardized building materials. Even the smallest alleyways were designed to accommodate drainage, showing a civic concern that went far beyond personal comfort. There were no grand avenues lined with statues or triumphal arches. Instead, there was quiet efficiency, an urban order rooted in cooperation rather than display. Shared spaces told the story of community identity. Wells, courtyards, workshops, and markets were where social life unfolded. In ancient Anatolia, neighbors shared ovens and mills. In Sumer, public courtyards became spaces for storytelling and local gatherings. And in early Chinese settlements, communal halls were built where elders met to deliberate, where rituals of planting and harvest were performed. Public architecture, even before it became monumental, expressed the collective spirit. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were economic centers, storage facilities, and symbols of unity. The ziggurat or pyramid towered above the homes, reminding every citizen of their place within a divine order. Yet beneath those vast shadows, life continued in the hum of ordinary walls, where the architecture of intimacy defined the human condition far more than stone monuments ever could. The earliest builders were improvisers, not architects. They mixed mud with straw, baked it in the sun, and learned through generations how to balance wall thickness with roof weight. But over time, even these humble materials became canvases for meaning. The act of building itself became sacred. To raise walls was to impose order upon chaos, to tame nature with geometry. The alignment of doorways, the direction of sleeping quarters, the presence of altars, all carried ritual importance. Even decay had meaning. When homes crumbled, they were often rebuilt on the same foundations, creating tells, artificial mounds formed by centuries of habitation. In places like Çatalhöyük, these layers rose like archives of memory, preserving thousands of years of daily life. Each new generation built atop the bones of the last, as if continuity itself were a form of architecture. Inside these homes, furniture was minimal but purposeful: low stools, reed mats, clay storage jars, woven baskets. Walls were often plastered and whitewashed to reflect sunlight. In wealthier dwellings, painted murals depicted rivers, animals, or deities, perhaps a way to bring the outside world inward. The boundary between the domestic and the divine was never firm. Every home was a microcosm of creation. Urban density also brought innovation. The need for airflow led to roof living, terraces where people cooked, slept, or watched the stars. From above, the cities of the ancient Near East looked like patchworks of flat rooftops, alive with evening chatter and lamplight. The line between architecture and community blurred. Buildings were not inert spaces, but living extensions of human rhythm. In the public realm, architecture expressed power. The earliest city walls symbolized both protection and identity, defining who belonged within and who did not. To enter a city gate was to pass into a world of law, order, and belonging. Streets led to central courtyards or temples, where civic rituals reinforced the hierarchy that architecture already embodied. The layout itself taught obedience. The path to the sacred was straight, but the road to home was winding. As civilizations matured, architecture grew increasingly specialized. Workshops produced standardized bricks, masons formed guilds, and city layouts began to follow symbolic geometry, cardinal directions, sacred ratios, or mythic alignments. In early Mesopotamian cities, the entire plan was oriented toward the ziggurat, as though life itself revolved around divine architecture. In Egypt, settlements aligned with the Nile's flow, connecting earthly order to cosmic rhythm. Yet for all the grandeur that would follow, the pyramids, palaces, and temples, the architecture of daily life remained the foundation of civilization. These were spaces not built for immortality, but for continuity, for families to eat, rest, and tell stories, for neighbors to greet each other across walls, for life to unfold within boundaries that felt safe and known. In the end, what defined ancient architecture was not scale but purpose. It was the architecture of belonging. Civilization's first builders were not chasing beauty. They were securing memory, laying down permanence in a world of impermanence. Every brick, every courtyard, every shared street was a declaration. We are here. We endure. The rise of architecture marked the rise of shared life itself. And soon that shared life would turn outward. From the walls of homes and cities, humanity would begin to shape the landscape beyond. The fields, canals, and networks that tied distant societies together in trade and communication. Civilization did not begin with walls, writing, or war. It began with belonging. The earliest people who settled in cities were not merely building homes. They were constructing something invisible yet enduring, a sense of we. Community was the architecture of the spirit, the unseen foundation upon which every field was plowed, every temple raised, every law obeyed. When humans first began to live in groups larger than families, they faced a challenge that no other species had solved: how to trust strangers. The hunter-gatherer band had relied on kinship and familiarity, but the first cities brought together hundreds, then thousands, who shared no bloodline. The success of civilization depended on the invention of a new kind of bond, one made not of biology, but belief. In the villages of the Fertile Crescent, this bond took shape around shared labor. Cooperation was survival. A single farmer could not manage the irrigation ditches that sustained his crops, but a dozen families working together could tame the river. The first communities were built on mutual dependence. On the floodplain of the Tigris or the basin of the Nile, every person's fate flowed into the next. The harvest belonged not just to one household, but to all. This practical cooperation soon evolved into something deeper, a moral order. The very act of working together required trust, and that trust gave birth to norms. Fairness in trade, honesty in measure, loyalty to kin and neighbor. These invisible rules, far older than written law, were civilization's first code of conduct. Long before kings declared decrees, ordinary people had learned the social alchemy of reciprocity, the idea that to give was to receive, that order could emerge from cooperation. In Mesopotamia, the city was imagined as a living organism, sustained by the shared labor of its inhabitants. Every citizen was a cell within a larger body, each role essential to the whole. Temples served as both spiritual and civic centers, warehouses for grain, gathering places for decisions, sanctuaries for rituals. To serve the temple was not only to honor the gods, but to serve the community itself. This fusion of religion and civic duty turned faith into the earliest form of social cohesion. Across the desert in Egypt, the same principle took grander form. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler, but a living god, the axis around which all order revolved. The people did not work for him alone, they worked through him, for Ma'at, the divine balance that kept the world stable. In the construction of temples and tombs, in the synchronization of planting and harvest, Egyptians found identity in collective purpose. Every worker's sweat on the stone was a prayer in motion, a contribution to cosmic harmony. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley, the idea of community was more egalitarian, but no less powerful. The uniformity of urban planning, the standardized bricks, the shared water systems, the orderly streets, revealed a society guided by consensus rather than kingship. Here, cooperation was not commanded. It was coordinated. No palaces, no royal tombs, no grand inscriptions proclaiming a single ruler's might. Instead, the Indus cities were bound by a quieter, civic faith. That balance itself was sacred. As these societies matured, the sense of community expanded beyond the village and the city. Pilgrimages, festivals, and markets began to weave distant peoples together into cultural networks. Traders carried not only goods, but stories, songs, and symbols, each an ambassador of shared meaning. Through exchange came empathy. Through contact came continuity. The road was as much a vessel of culture as the temple or the school. Yet the idea of community was never only material. It was profoundly spiritual. Early religion was not an escape from society, but a reflection of it. The gods were imagined in the likeness of human order, a divine council mirroring earthly councils, cosmic cooperation mirroring human labor. When Sumerians prayed to Enlil for good weather, they were not merely pleading, they were reaffirming a collective truth, that their survival depended on harmony, both celestial and social. Festivals and rituals served to renew this harmony. In the Akkadian New Year festival, the king's symbolic humiliation before the priest reminded everyone that authority itself was conditional, dependent on the gods, yes, but also on the people's faith. In Egypt's harvest festivals, music and dance erased class boundaries, if only briefly. Even in the simplest village rites, the sharing of bread, the lighting of lamps, the rhythm of togetherness pulsed. To gather was to remember who they were. This memory, of being part of something larger, was civilization's emotional core. It turned survival into meaning. Archaeologists have found clay tokens and small figurines buried beneath thresholds or hidden in walls. Household charms meant to protect the community within. These were not private superstitions, but shared expressions of faith in collective safety. A city's walls kept out enemies, but its unity kept out despair. Of course, the bonds that held communities together were also tested. Class divisions, scarcity, and ambition could fracture unity. But even conflict reinforced the necessity of cooperation. Revolt, reform, and rebuilding were all acts of communal renewal. Every generation had to rediscover the we that sustained them. It was this continual negotiation between self and society, freedom and order, that gave ancient life its pulse. By the Bronze Age, the idea of community had evolved into citizenship, a concept first articulated in early Mesopotamian and Greek cities. To belong was no longer just to live within walls. It was to share rights, duties, and values. Even in societies without democracy, participation carried meaning. Festivals, taxes, oaths, each act was a reaffirmation of belonging. Community had become both inheritance and responsibility. The architecture of this idea was intangible but enduring. In the layout of homes and markets, in the synchronization of calendars and rituals, in the language that bound people together, we see a shared heartbeat. Every civilization that followed, from the republics of Greece to the empires of China, built upon this inheritance. The first societies had shown that the most powerful structure was not made of stone, but of trust. To walk through the ruins of ancient cities today, through the narrow lanes of Ur, the drained wells of Mohenjo-Daro, the fallen columns of Memphis, is to feel the echo of that trust. The stones may be silent, but their arrangement still speaks of unity. Each threshold crossed, each courtyard entered, tells a story of people who believed that survival meant togetherness, that to live well was to live with others. Civilization's greatest lesson was not how to build, write, or rule, but how to belong. In the flicker of oil lamps shared between neighbors in the markets where grain and laughter changed hands, in the songs that rose over riverbanks after harvest, humanity discovered the rhythm that would carry it through millennia, the rhythm of community. From these earliest bonds, the future would unfold. With faith and cooperation came ambition, the desire to reach farther, to connect wider. The next chapter of civilization would not be confined to one city or one people. Roads, caravans, and ships would link the world in networks of exchange. The birth of economy, diplomacy, and culture on a scale never seen before. This is where belonging begins. Fall asleep. To the First Societies is Episode 5, Act 2, Part 1 of the Sleepless Timelines series, an immersive exploration of how humanity's first communities learned to live, work, and believe together. After mastering time, writing, and agriculture, civilization took its next step, building society. From the family hearths of Sumer to the bustling markets of the Indus Valley, this episode traces how people forged identity, hierarchy, and faith out of shared labor and collective life. You'll drift through the homes and temples of the ancient world, where kinship shaped survival, trade bound strangers into allies, and festivals reminded everyone of their place in the cosmic order. Learn how class and gender defined power, how early laws preserved balance, and how knowledge, medicine, and architecture turned daily life into culture itself. Each civilization found its own rhythm of belonging. Egyptians united through Ma'at, Mesopotamians through temple duty, Indus citizens through civic harmony, and early Chinese societies through the balance of heaven's will. Together they formed the first true social fabric, proof that humanity's greatest invention wasn't the plow or the tablet, but community. This calm cinematic narration will carry you through the sound of ancient streets, the murmur of markets, the call of temple bells, the heartbeat of cities learning what it meant to live together. Perfect for relaxing, studying, or falling asleep as you imagine the warmth of shared fires beneath an ancient sky. This chapter opens Act 2, The Life Within Civilization, following naturally from Episode 4's journey through the birth of time. Together they form a continuous timeline of how humanity learned not just to measure the world, but to inhabit it. Next in the series, Episode 6, Act 2, Part 2, Fall Asleep to the First Traders.